So I hope you were able to effectively distinguish between habituation and sensory adaptation, in part because habituation, although it's presented in Module 26, it is probably the simplest type of learning out there. It's just learning not to respond to something after repeated presentations of the thing. So it doesn't even count as an example of associative learning, which is the type of learning that we're going to spend a huge chunk of our time on this unit. So the nice thing about this unit is although sometimes the content can get a little abstract, like the names of different processes of learning can be a little tricky for people, there really are only three major types of learning that we're going to be addressing, and two of them are associative in nature. Associative learning is just the name we give to learning that happens when organisms are learning that two things go together or appear together, so they're learning an association between two things. You're going to be learning today and during our next class period about classical conditioning, which is a very simple type of associative learning where an organism's learning a link between two stimuli. So two things in my environment go together. Particular famous example of this is Pavlov's work in his classical conditioning experiments with dogs. A dog learning that a tone and the arrival of food go together are two external stimuli over which the organism has no control, but over which it has to respond to. And that's the basic nature of classical conditioning, is that we're linking two things that happen. Neither of them are under the organism's control, but the organism may have to respond to one of them. So learning to respond a little more quickly by predicting the arrival of that stimulus is an important thing. And we're going to be unpacking how that happens today. Operant conditioning is another type of associative learning that we're going to spend a good deal of time on because it has a bunch of associated mechanisms. Operant conditioning is something that's a little more intuitive, I think, to students because this is something that we operate on all the time in our environments. Operant conditioning is just the idea that an organism might learn the connection or association between its response, so something it does, and a consequence of that behavior that follows it. So if I do my homework, I get good grades. If I eat that cupcake, I feel satisfied. Those kinds of things, or by contrast, like if I touch that hot thing, I get burned. So learning to increase or decrease a behavior after making a connection between this behavior and its consequence is a type of learning that a lot of organisms, including people, engage in. Now, when we close the unit, we'll actually start talking about some more sophisticated types of learning that were uncovered and classified a little bit later. These include more cognitive approaches to learning. And cognitive, like you might recognize based on our earlier units on that topic, includes stuff about like mental information and mental activities. One of those forms of learning that we're going to spend a little bit of time on is just observational learning through observation. It's not as complicated in terms of the terminology that goes with it, and it's pretty intuitive to most of my students, like the idea that, oh, you might watch something and then pick up some information from that. That's the heart of observational learning. So let's dig into classical conditioning a little bit, because that's the one that is probably least familiar to most of my students when they start this unit, and it has probably the greatest deal of abstraction associated with it. But it's a simple process that most organisms are capable of exhibiting, and it underlies a lot of automatic conditioned responses in people. So for that reason, Pavlov, who's credited with describing the language associated with this stuff, is a pretty big deal in the scope of famous psychologists. So people who don't know much about psychology, if you ask them to name two famous psychologists, they're likely to tell you Freud, who we'll encounter a lot more over the course of this year, and Pavlov. A lot of people have heard of his work, and there's important reasons for that. Pavlov's work with classical conditioning in dogs actually laid the foundation for a major shift in the focus of psychology as a whole. One of his followers, or people who found his work interesting and used it as the foundation for their own work, was John Watson. John Watson over here, sometimes known as the father of behaviorism. And you might recall from our introductory modules this year that he was the founder of a school of thought, behaviorism, that argued that psychology should not focus on thoughts and conscious motivations and memory, those kinds of things, because he thought those were too squishy and unobservable. he didn't think those would be an appropriate focus for people who are trying to use a scientific approach, because science needs to focus on stuff that's measurable and observable. So instead, for about 40 years, from the 1920s to the 1960s, psychologists almost invariably were behaviorists, and they focused most on what kinds of things increases or decreases a behavior in a subject, and classical conditioning was one of those mechanisms. So Watson himself actually did some specific work in classical conditioning, which we'll talk about next time we're together. But this idea of behaviorism, the notion that we should focus only on behaviors and what kinds of things increase or decrease them, and what kinds of things precede or predict them, that also was incredibly influential in sparking the work of B.F. Skinner, who we'll encounter later this unit. But he is the guy who classified and came up with all the terminology and a lot of the major research designs behind operant conditioning, the idea of learning by reward or punishment, the idea that you connect a response with the stimulus that follows it. And more broadly, I mean, Pavlov's work also ends up influencing evolutionary psychology to some degree, because it pointed out that because this simple process of learning is something that most organisms are capable of, it also became really obvious early on how adaptive this is, how it helps organisms survive in their environments. Because if you can learn to predict outcomes in your environment and respond accordingly, you'll be able to adapt or adjust to changing environmental circumstances much better than organisms who cannot do that. So what was Pavlov actually doing? Well, okay, this kind of strikes people as surprising at first, but he was actually a physiologist. He would not have even called himself a psychologist. In fact, he kind of was upset about even being connected with psychology, because at the time he didn't think it was a very well-developed discipline and thought it was too unscientific. This is the late 1800s. So he definitely saw himself as someone who is practicing medicine or doing research in physiology. And he was studying digestion using dogs as subjects. And he did all kinds of stuff studying the digestive process. But one part of the digestive process he was interested in was salivating, producing drool or spit, which is kind of gross to think about. But they were collecting tubes, like they'd have these glass vials that were attached to the dog's salivary glands, and they were noticing that dogs were salivating even before you would put food in their mouths, which at first is kind of a terrible problem if you're trying to measure salivation associated with eating, because they're actually doing the behavior before you're trying to measure the response to something that you're presenting, and so it's kind of contaminating your collection of that material. But he actually suspected that there was something to this, that, why would dogs actually be drooling before you place food in their mouths if the drooling is just a digestive process? It's almost like the dog's body is anticipating its need to digest the food, and so it's starting to salivate even before the food is in the dog's mouth, which, if you're just a physiologist, that's intriguing. Why is it that the body is almost predicting, kind of like psychically predicting something that is going to arrive? The taste buds on the tongue and the salivary glands in the mouth, they themselves don't have any way of predicting the food's arriving. So there's clearly something else going on at the level of the brain that's allowing this stuff to happen. So as he studied this stuff, he actually established a number of different systems for talking about what classical conditioning is and looks like. And they did this after a lot of classical conditioning experiments where they taught the dog to salivate in response to all kinds of things. So they found out that, like, if the dogs were actually drooling when someone would just walk down the hallway before arriving at the enclosure where the dogs were held. So just the click of the heels of the experimenters on the floor in the hallway outside the room was enough to set them to drooling. And if they could salivate in response to that, Pavlov speculated they could salivate in response to anything. So his most famous work involved, like, ringing a bell or presenting a tone, and then presenting the dogs with food immediately following that to see if they could learn a connection between the presentation of the bell and the arrival of the food. And sure enough, the dogs did. He got them to drool in response to hearing the bell or the tone alone. And this unleashed a kind of new era in the history of understanding unconscious responsive mechanisms in animals.